California's Corcoran SHU, a prison of isolation suffering documentary. Buried deep in California's Central Valley lies a prison so infamous that its very name sends chills through the criminal justice system. Corcoran State Prison. Within it, a section known simply as the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, exists, a place where men are locked away for decades in near total isolation. Here, confinement is absolute. Sensory deprivation, solitary cells, and relentless schedules are not just punishment, they are designed to break the mind. 22 to 24 hours a day, a single man exists in a cell barely larger than a small room, with nothing but the walls around him and the emptiness within. For years, the reality inside Corcoran's SHU remained hidden, shielded from the outside world. But legal cases, psychological research, and human rights investigations have revealed what life here truly entails, a reality few could imagine and fewer still could endure. What happens when the human mind is forced into isolation for years, even decades? What toll does it take on sanity, identity, and the very essence of being human? By the end of this documentary, the answers will be clear, and they may shock you. Content notice. This documentary contains verified descriptions of prison conditions, psychological effects, and human rights issues for educational purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. Medical disclaimer: the content is research-based and does not constitute medical advice. For personal mental health concerns, consult qualified professionals. Don't forget like, comment, and subscribe. The architecture of isolation. The SHU is more than a cell. It is a carefully engineered environment designed to control, manipulate, and ultimately erode the human psyche. Each cell is barely larger than a parking space. The walls are cement, the light is limited, and the air feels trapped. Hours pass in silence or in relentless, haunting monotony. Every element is calculated to strip away the human spirit, leaving only survival. Sensory deprivation does not merely slow time. It alters perception, distorts reality, and rewires the mind. Inmates subjected to prolonged confinement report hallucinations, intense anxiety, and profound paranoia. Identity fades. Days blur together. Even basic human needs are regimented, creating an environment where the psychological toll is as extreme as the physical confinement itself. For decades, men have been trapped in this relentless cycle. And while the walls confine the body, the architecture of isolation attacks the mind itself. But when the suffering inside could no longer be ignored, the law finally stepped in, and the story of that intervention begins with a landmark case, Coleman versus Wilson. Coleman versus Wilson. For decades, the suffering inside Corcoran's SHU went largely unnoticed, hidden behind walls and bureaucracy. That changed in 1990 with the landmark federal case Coleman versus Wilson. This case would expose, in painstaking detail, the deliberate indifference of the California Department of Corrections to the mental health of inmates trapped in long-term isolation. The plaintiffs were inmates whose lives had been shattered by years of confinement in the SHU. They described severe psychological deterioration, hallucinations, uncontrollable anxiety, depression so deep it threatened the will to live. Expert witnesses, including psychologists and psychiatrists, testified that the conditions were not just harsh, they were dangerous, even inhumane. The court documents revealed a system that ignored warnings, delayed interventions, and failed to provide even the most basic mental health care. Policies intended to protect inmates' well-being were, in practice, meaningless. What emerged was a shocking picture, a prison system that had built not only physical barriers, but psychological ones, trapping men in a cycle of mental and emotional suffering. Coleman versus Wilson forced California to confront what it had long avoided, the reality that isolation could cause permanent psychological damage, and that the state had a legal and moral obligation to address it. The ruling sent shockwaves through the prison system, but even decades later, the echoes of the case remain. It became the first crack in the wall of secrecy, revealing just how fragile the human mind could become when stripped of contact, light, and hope. And yet, the story of suffering did not end with a courtroom victory. As researchers began to study inmates more closely, a new term emerged: one that would come to define the unique psychological impact of life inside the SHU, Corcoran syndrome. Corcoran syndrome. After Coleman versus Wilson brought national attention to the SHU, psychologists began studying the true mental impact of decades spent in solitary confinement. Among the most significant contributions came from Dr. Pablo Friedman, whose research would define what has come to be known as Corcoran syndrome. Corcoran syndrome describes a cluster of psychological symptoms uniquely associated with long-term isolation. Inmates living in the SHU often experience chronic anxiety, uncontrollable paranoia, and severe depression. Time loses meaning. Sleep patterns collapse. Hallucinations, both visual and auditory, become commonplace. Simple decisions like choosing what to eat or how to pass the day turn into monumental challenges. Dr. Friedman's studies showed that even inmates with no prior history of mental illness could descend into profound psychological distress after months or years in the SHU. For those trapped for decades, the effects were permanent. Some could not reintegrate into general prison populations. Others struggled to interact with family, or even to trust their own memories. What makes Corcoran syndrome so insidious is its subtlety. Inmates may appear physically unharmed, compliant, even calm. Yet inside, their minds are under siege, a relentless battle waged in silence. The very design of the SHU, its tiny cells, sensory deprivation, and extreme isolation, creates the conditions for this syndrome, turning confinement into a slow psychological experiment on human endurance. And while Corcoran syndrome explained the mental deterioration inside the SHU, another system, called the step-down program, promised a way out, a path that, in reality, often led to more frustration and despair. The step-down program reality. In theory, the step-down program was designed to give inmates a path out of the SHU. It promised gradual reintegration, limited privileges, increased social contact, and eventually a return to the general population. It was meant to offer hope, a way for men trapped in isolation to reclaim a semblance of normal life. But for many, the reality was far harsher. The program's structure was inconsistent and often arbitrary. Inmates who demonstrated compliance and mental stability were still left waiting for years, sometimes decades, for advancement. Criteria for progression were opaque, leaving many to wonder if freedom was ever attainable. Former inmates describe a Kafkaesque system where small infractions, real or perceived, could reset their progress entirely. Psychological evaluations were inconsistent, and bureaucratic delays often made participation feel like a cruel illusion rather than a genuine opportunity for release. The step-down program exposed a painful truth. The SHU's isolation was not only physical and psychological but institutional. Even when programs existed to end confinement, the system itself became a barrier. Men who survived decades of isolation emerged not only scarred by their environment but also frustrated by the false promises meant to save them. And as the limits of this program became apparent, the human cost of prolonged isolation could no longer be measured in policy alone. It was measured in broken minds, shattered identities, and the silent suffering of men who had endured the unimaginable. This suffering comes into sharp focus when we hear from those who lived it, the inmates who reached the breaking point. Breaking point. For those who endured decades inside the SHU, isolation was not merely uncomfortable, it was devastating. The walls may have been concrete, but the real damage was invisible, etched into the mind and spirit. Former inmates recount a reality that defies imagination. Hours stretch into days, days into months, and months into years with no meaningful human contact. Friends, family, even the simplest conversations become distant memories. Some describe hearing voices that aren't there, seeing shadows that do not exist, and feeling a crushing weight of despair that no one can lift. Many reached what experts call the breaking point. Mental health deteriorated to the extent that some could no longer function outside their cells. Rage, depression, anxiety, and paranoia became constant companions. A simple interaction could trigger panic. A small inconvenience could erupt into uncontrollable anger. These were not isolated cases, They were the predictable consequences of a system designed for total isolation. Yet even in the darkest moments, resilience emerged. Some inmates found ways to survive mentally, counting tiles on the ceiling, memorizing books, or creating elaborate routines to maintain a sense of control. Still, the toll was undeniable. Every story, every testimony revealed the same grim reality. Prolonged solitary confinement can break the human mind, and Corcoran's SHU was the proving ground. As shocking as these personal accounts are, the world outside began to take notice. International human rights organizations weighed in, offering another perspective on Corcoran's conditions and the ethical questions they raised. International assessment. While the suffering inside Corcoran's SHU was painfully clear to those who experienced it firsthand, the world beyond the prison walls began to take notice. International human rights organizations, including the United Nations and Amnesty International, evaluated the conditions and raised urgent concerns about the treatment of inmates. Reports highlighted that California's SHU was not just a national issue, it was a matter of global human rights. The prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and lack of adequate mental health care were deemed extreme, inhumane, and, in some cases, potentially violating international law. Experts noted that the psychological damage inflicted by long-term solitary confinement was well documented. What was happening at Corcoran wasn't just cruel, it was avoidable. They recommended systemic reform, increased oversight, and alternative approaches to prison management that emphasized rehabilitation over psychological destruction. Yet despite international condemnation and mounting evidence, changes were slow. Policies remained inconsistent, and the SHU continued to operate largely under the same framework that had caused decades of harm. The assessments painted a stark picture. The human cost of isolation was profound, the laws insufficient, and the urgency for reform undeniable. The debate surrounding Corcoran SHU raises a fundamental question. When does the pursuit of security cross the line into cruelty? And what responsibility does society have to ensure that justice does not come at the expense of humanity? This question remains at the heart of ongoing discussions about prison reform. Reform or resistance? The story of Corcoran's SHU is not just a tale of walls and cells. It is a story of human endurance, suffering, and the limits of our justice system. Decades of isolation have left scars that may never fully heal, not just on the inmates themselves, but on the conscience of a society that allowed it to continue. Reform advocates argue that the SHU is a symbol of a broken system, one that prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation. They call for policies that protect mental health, meaningful oversight, and alternatives to solitary confinement. The step-down program, while well-intentioned, remains incomplete. The human cost of its failure is evident in the stories we have heard. At the same time, some resist change, citing security concerns and the need for strict control within the prison system. But the evidence is clear. Prolonged isolation does not rehabilitate, it destroys. Corcoran SHU stands as a stark reminder that justice without humanity can become a cage for the soul as much as for the body. The debate is ongoing, but one truth is undeniable. The men of Corcoran SHU are a testament to the resilience and fragility of the human mind. And as long as the world watches, questions remain. How far should isolation go? And at what point does society intervene to protect those trapped behind the walls? The walls of Corcoran may be unyielding, but awareness, advocacy, and action can break the cycle. Reform or resistance? This is the choice that defines the future of America's prisons and the fate of countless lives still confined in isolation.